Wojenko, wojenko, cóż ty za pani? Że za tobą idą chłopcy malowani. And I don't know where this line percolated up in my head. I don't remember knowing it. But in the last couple months, it percolated into my head. And it's a song that's addressed to war. A song being sung to war. In Polish, war is wojna. And here it's wojenko. It's being addressed to war in the diminutive. Like, and it's feminine. Nice little war, nice little war. What kind of woman are you that all these young men go chasing after you? I was born in Warsaw in 1944. In other words, during World War II. So that song has resonance for me. And also, it led me to think about the fact that the name of Warsaw in English, in Polish is Warszawa, and I don't think it has meanings, but in English, Warsaw saw war. I find that amazing too. My parents were both born in Krakow, Poland. My father in 1911, my mother in 1913. And they were my family is Jewish. In Krakow, there wasn't a completely drastic separation of Jews and non-Jews. And although there were quotas at the university, so quotas for how many Jews could be admitted, my father got into the university, into the law school, the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He went to law school. And when he was in law school, there were things going on where there was a Jewish fraternity, and sometimes a right-wing fraternity would come and attack the Jewish fraternity. And my father would go to find his friend Sterankiewicz, who was in a socialist fraternity. And that fraternity would come and fight with the attacking fraternity and help the Jews get through it. So my father became a lawyer in Poland. And then on September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. And my father went to join his army regiment because he was enlisted. When he got there, he discovered that the regiment had been disbanded. I don't know the story of how, but it was disbanded. So he couldn't be with them. And he concluded that the only thing to do was to go back home to Krakow and ask my mother to marry him. So he went back home, apparently against a tide of people who were escaping from the border. So he traveled against this tide back to Krakow. And he asked my mother to marry him. And they got married on September 4th, 1939, the fourth day of the war. There were restrictions placed on Jews, different restrictions. One was they couldn't move. They couldn't change residences as of 1940. And they couldn't ride in trains. And then also sometime in 1940, there was an edict that they had to move into a ghetto. And my parents did that. They moved into the ghetto. And at first, the ghetto provided relative security only because of the huge danger outside the ghetto. If they were caught outside the ghetto without some kind of work papers that made it legal, they could just be shot in the street. So the ghetto was relative safety. However, it was also an illusion, I guess, of safety. And my mother didn't talk to me as I was growing up very much about the horrible things that happened. I think she was sparing me. But she did have one memory from when they were in the ghetto of seeing an older woman shot and her brain and eyes splattering against a wall. And it seems like that experience made them decide they had to leave the ghetto. I know very little about my grandparents. I never met them, or at least not when I was old enough to recognize that. They were killed in the war. But what happened was when my parents left the ghetto, my father forged fake ID documents for him and my mother, and he did that for the other people in the family. But the grandparents, because they were older, felt it was too risky to try to go somewhere else, and they stayed in Krakow, in the ghetto. I heard almost nothing growing up. My parents didn't talk about what happened to them. And amazingly, it was my uncle, my mother's younger brother, who told me, and I probably was in my 20s or 30s or something, and he was old and heading to disappearing. And he told me that there was what they called an action in the ghetto. And my parents were no longer in the ghetto, but the grandparents were still there, and one of his sisters was there. And I hadn't heard about this. And he also told me that he had built in the apartment where they lived, he had built a hiding place under a ceiling, so I guess a fake roof and space above it. And they stored pillows and food and water in that space. And when the action happened, they went up there for shelter. But he left. He was only 18, and he scrambled out to disappear from the action. Then he went back, maybe the same day even, I'm getting that, or maybe the next day. And he was ecstatic because the Germans were gone, and actions usually lasted a few days. So he was very happy that they were gone. Then he went to the apartment, and they weren't there. And he told me he never saw them again. My father took the name, his name had been Henryk Tanz, and the name he took was Mieczysław Święcicki. So a classic Polish name, a standard Polish first name, and Święcicki was a very Polish last name. But not only that, the root word of that name was saint. You know, saint is a name that's used in English too, and this one is derived from the word saint. So it was as Catholic as you could be. And that my father managed to get a fake ID, and that was with help from people who could create documents that looked like real documents. And I still have that. Mieczysław Święcicki. And then later, when I was born, 4 years later, I was Krystyna Maria Święcicka. So I was part of that same false identity and had Krystyna Maria. And later, I got the name Tanz back, but I was still Christine Maria and stuck with that. They had this fake identity, but they could get away with that for several reasons. One is that, well, one thing that helped was that my father was blonde and had blue eyes. My mother had dark hair and brown eyes, but my father's coloring wasn't typical Jewish coloring. They spoke both Polish and Yiddish, but they spoke Polish without a Yiddish accent, which made it conceivable for them to pass. And they also exercised enormous caution. Like when they took the train to Warsaw from Krakow, they went by train. Jews weren't allowed to be on the train, period. And they didn't sit together. They were in the same wagon, so they could see each other. But my mother sat in the very front and my father sat in the back. And they never sat together on a train during the war because they thought that the evidence of their appearance or the way they communicated might be clues and give them away. But also, they felt it was safer not to be together so that if one of them ran into a problem, the other one could in some way intervene. And there was an occasion when on the street once, they were walking but not together, and my father saw my mother being surrounded by a group of men. And he was at a distance of 50 feet because they kept that kind of distance when they were circulating. So he didn't know exactly what was happening, but he thought there was danger. And he went over and he offered a bribe to get her out of there. And they took the money. And my mother and my father got away. So there were preconditions that applied. They were young, they were strong, they were brave. They gave each other essential support. They got married again every time there was some kind of a change in identity, so that they would have a marriage document that matched their new identity. So I believe the story is that they got married 4 times during the war. They never got divorced, but they got married 4 times. And one amazing thing, kind of in recent life, I don't think I have my mother's ring that I know of anymore, but I must have had it for a while. My son met my mother, so he knew his grandmother a tiny bit. But he saw her wedding ring and he saw that there were initials in it. And they were initials from one of the fake identities. When my mother's brother left Krakow after that action where his parents and sister vanished, he joined my parents in Warsaw. He followed them there. And they took him in, but they kind of kept him in hiding until he could learn to manage his speech, to maintain a disguise better. They managed to keep him hidden and to coax him and train him to avoid those expressions that would give away the fact that he spoke Yiddish. In Warsaw, my father started a business, and he had been involved with paper, and he was shrewd about sort of what people needed, and he felt he couldn't go to Krakow to get paper from the sources that he was familiar with. And the paper was all kinds of paper, writing paper, paper for greeting cards, cigarette paper. But my uncle, who was younger and hadn't been as much as well known in the community, he wouldn't be automatically identified. And so he took on the job of going to Krakow to these sources of paper and collecting the paper and bringing it back to Warsaw, where my father managed to sell it to people and make a little bit of a living on paper. There was danger from many directions in Poland. And I'm not just from the Nazis, but from Polish officers in the police and just people in the public. And one time in Warsaw, when my father was walking on the street, a man said to him, "I know you, you're a Jew." And my father punched the guy and hit him hard. My father was strong and had done some amateur boxing. He immediately punched him, and people kind of knocked him down. People gathered around, and my father said, "He said I was a Jew." And then he walked away. Another horrible story. 6 Polish police officers came to their door and said they heard there was a Jew living there. And he said, "I'm not a Jew. I'm in the underground army, in fact." And they said, "Well, show us your documents." And he said, "Anybody can have fake documents, but take a look." I don't remember how he said, said, "Look in my pants." And what it was Jews were circumcised and Poles were not circumcised. But incredibly enough, he had had some surgery to hide the fact that he was circumcised. So he used that to escape from these 6 officers. After that terrifying incident with the 6 officers, they decided they had to leave. And they told their landlady that they were just going off on vacation. And they crossed the river, the Vistula River, in Polish, Wisła, to a little town on the other side called Otwock. So they were located there. And soon after they had crossed over, there was the Warsaw Uprising. And my parents were away on the other side of the river. They could see smoke rising and they could see the destruction. And so amazingly, they had been saved because of this invasion by 6 Polish police officers that had scared them out of Warsaw. So that's how the way my father would tell me the story, that horrible experience with the 6 Polish police officers had contributed to saving their lives in the end. when my mother went into labor, they tried to get some help. And they were walking in just, farming territory, and a man and a horse and buggy passed them. And they got a ride with this man and with the horse and buggy. And he took them to what had been a Polish hospital, but was now a small Russian military hospital. And so I was born there in this little military hospital in the countryside. And the doctor who delivered me asked them if they knew what day it was. And they said no. He told them it was Yom Kippur. And so one, that was a revelation. But the other aspect of it that was extraordinary was that clearly that doctor realized they were Jewish, and he was sharing Jewish information without any hint of threat. And it turned out that he was a Russian Jew. So he was working in this little military hospital in Poland, and that's who delivered me into the world. And it was, I guess, after I was born that they went to Danzig or Gdańsk, and we were living a kind of peaceful existence there. And I remember being told about the things that we had in our lives that we hadn't had. We had a goat, and I drank the goat's milk. The goat lived in the basement of the house. And one dramatic moment in my life was when I went to the basement. I was just 3, and the goat was eating laundry. And so I screamed. So we had some possessions. I had a buggy, and until then, I guess my mother just carried me, and had a sled in the winter to play with. And we had that goat. They decided that they should leave Poland because of worry about Russian occupation, because the Nazis were gone. And so they decided to go to France. And in 1948, we left. Oh, my brother was born in Poland, in Gdańsk, in 1948. So I not only had a goat and a buggy and a sled, I had a little brother, my wonderful little brother. Then that group of 4 of us moved to France and lived in Paris, and a suburb of Paris called Enghien-les-Bains, which had a casino. And my father managed to earn a bit of a living in a casino. They had hidden money in an armchair on the trip to France, and the chair had succeeded, and so they had some money, but not enough to live on for very long. He needed to get work. He wanted to get a job, but you couldn't get a job without a work permit, and he couldn't get a work permit. The government wasn't letting him get a work permit. So he came up with a scheme, and I was his partner even, He took me along to the Ministry of Labor. At that point, I was about 5, I think. He took me to the Ministry of Labor, and he said that he needed a work permit, that he was a father of 2 children. And he presented me as evidence of his fatherhood, said his other child was at home, and that he needed to have a job to provide for us. And he said that if they didn't give him a work permit, he would celebrate the upcoming 2000th anniversary of Paris by jumping off the Eiffel Tower. And he got a work permit, and therefore was able to get jobs. He had work and things were manageable. They had to learn French, and my brother and I had to learn French. So we did learn French. I started school in France and started learning how to read in French. But my father, whose judgment had been so excellent, started worrying that Russia was maybe going to invade Western Europe and felt that we better get out. And we were going to go to Australia. And they had belongings, household belongings, stuff that I remember was very, household stuff, teacups, dishes, stuff that seems hard to travel with anyway. But they pack their belongings because I think that's one thing that migrants do if they can, because they're not going to have a lot of money to replace their household goods. So they packed our belongings and shipped them to Australia, and we were going to follow. And then visas to the US came through. I don't know what made that change happen, but they got visas to the US and decided to come to the US. And as a little girl, I used to think about who was using our dishes, who was drinking out of our teacups in Australia. But we were never reunited with our teacups. When we came to the United States, we were in New York, and our life was still kind of disordered. But my father had trouble getting work, and we moved to Chicago and settled there, and then began kind of engaging in the institutions of life in the United States. So my parents joined a synagogue, and my brother and I went to Sunday school and learned about Jewish traditions. I don't know how old I was when I learned about family members getting killed. My parents didn't talk to me much about their parents and who their parents had been and that they had been killed. As I say, I learned facts about that when I was a young adult from my uncle. I think in some ways they were grieving, but I also came to marvel that they managed, despite the incredible hardships they had gone through, they managed, for one thing, to give my brother and me a happy childhood. So they were not pouring their grief into us. And I considered that an astonishing thing. And I have funny little bits of memory. I remember I have a specific memory of my father when I was very young, and I don't know if I was still in Poland or in France, directing my attention to look at the shadow of a tree on a wall. And it was a very beautiful, sharp shadow. The tree didn't have leaves, so it was just its articulated branches projected onto the wall. And my father did that a lot with me, directing my attention to the beauty of nature. And that has stayed with me so much. I'm a hoarder of seashells and mesquite pods and all kinds of treasures from nature, and I'm an obsessive compulsive photographer and take pictures of nature almost every day. And I learned that from my father, and I think it was a way for him to get past what they had suffered. The fact that I was a Holocaust survivor wasn't an active part of my identity as a kid, and partly because my family didn't talk about it a lot, partly because I didn't know other kids who had that background and experience. So it was pushed away. And gradually it became more part of my life as I started reading. Even as a kid, I read the Diary of Anne Frank and and was given somehow the information that related to my family's story. I don't know how old I was. It was in school that I read it. But amazingly, it still wasn't such an active part of life. So I had this strange experience. I finished college in 1965. I had left Chicago and gone away to Harvard and Radcliffe, left my family behind. And that's been a revelation about academic, university, going to college in the USA. So often people want to go away to college, and it involves leaving your family and friends behind. And that's such a widespread phenomenon here. But I went back for a 30th reunion for college. And in our discussions at that reunion, it emerged that people I had known, including some people I was friends with, weren't necessarily specifically Holocaust survivors, but they were born like me in wartime, and that we had that experience, our families had had that experience, and it wasn't something that we had been very conscious of when we shared life in college. And we were discovering it at our 30th reunion. And it was dramatic to share it. And Harvard and Radcliffe draw people from across the world. People come from far away. So there are people who had had experiences with war beyond, certainly, well, just throughout Europe and other parts of the world too. So it became a very dramatic part of our reunion. And the idea sprang up that we should write our stories and put together a book. And that book ended up being assembled, and the title is Born into a World at War. And everybody who wrote a chapter was in my class, and their families had experienced the war somewhere, and they were in some way survivors of war. I came to Tucson to take a job after I finished my PhD. After college, I went back to Chicago and got a PhD at the university there. And it was interesting how my earlier life fed into my decision about what to study in grad school. My first language was Polish, and when I was 4, we moved to France, and I learned French. And then when I was 7, we moved to the US, and I learned English. And another factor was when I was in college, the university had started a program called freshman seminars. And as a freshman, in this new place in the world for me, because I had left home in Chicago, left my family, I had a seminar with Eric Erickson, who a wonderful and very famous psychologist who invented the term identity crisis. And I learned about identity. I learned about identity crisis from Erik Erikson himself as I was experiencing an identity crisis as a new student far away from home. And I ended up being interested in psychology, developmental psychology. And then language fed into that too, because of my history of learning 3 languages in a row. And in a way, I was the first in the family to become fluent in those languages, because my mother was at home. My father was working. I was at school. I learned French faster. I learned English faster. I became very interested in how kids learn to talk, and that became part of my life. And I did my dissertation on child language acquisition. And when I applied for jobs, there was a job here in the psychology department, and I applied for that and I got it. So I came to Tucson and I was teaching developmental psychology and psycholinguistics. And I had friends. I had a friend who was a linguist, and her husband, who taught in the linguistics department, and her husband taught in the philosophy department. And her husband was friends with Jean Paul. So through those connections, Jean Paul wasn't at the university, but through them, I met Jean Paul and we got married. And we had in common that we were both immigrants. But I was Jewish and he wasn't Jewish. But neither one of us is very religious. So that didn't become a big issue. My parents didn't make it an issue. And I think that they weren't just not making it an issue to be kind to me. I think they liked Jean Paul a lot. And we had some interesting things, deep things in common, because we were both from another country. And I pondered that and haven't come to full grips with it, but I think it might be a factor in how our marriage took shape and evolved. And with our son, he actually hasn't had very much of a religious background. In fact, he's a native Tucsonan and a citizen of the world. Well, it's an important part of my identity, in fact. And I've now joined the board of the Jewish History Museum in Tucson and the Holocaust Center. And I want that history to be part of the world. I think it's important for people everywhere to know about that extreme genocide. But not only the genocide, I think there are wonderful things in Jewish tradition as there are in other religious traditions. And I think it's valuable for various aspects of these traditions to continue and be known, but not to fight with each other. My life here in Tucson took an amazing turn. My work at the university ended, and but I was very fascinated to learn about the field of public art, and excited at the prospect of possibly joining that. And one of the things that helped me was contemplate such drastic changes was that my parents also had reinvented themselves numerous times, and I learned from them about reinventing oneself. But I also felt that the United States was hospitable to people reinventing themselves. And I wanted to launch into public art, but I didn't have a background. I didn't have training. but I had lots of ideas, and I was fascinated by it.
Why?
And well, I loved looking at it, and in the process of getting involved in it, I felt that I was growing deep roots in the place where I lived. So I had been forced out of places so often, and now I've lived here much longer than anywhere I've lived. And I've had the opportunity through the public art to celebrate the place where I live, because I do public art, and my public art focuses on places in the community. The first piece is called the Sun Circle. And of course, in Tucson, we live with the sun so intensely. And there are cultures elsewhere that have structures that follow the sun and inform people about it. And we didn't have that kind of thing here in Tucson. It's a little bit like Stonehenge because it's a circle oriented to the positions of the sun as the sun moves, or the earth that's changing its position. So, and it has 8 walls with little windows in them, trapezoid and squares. And for example, at the equinox, when the sun rises, it shines through a square window in one of the 8 walls and projects a square of light on the opposite wall. And so you can celebrate the passage of the year and learn about how those changes happen. It's a kind of calendar built in the environment. The project at the airport is called Silver Linings, and it's photographs of clouds painted onto steel. It draws on the phrase, every cloud has a silver lining. And originally, it was built as a concourse divider, and it was built so that as you went towards the flights, um, you the wall that the clouds were cut into and painted on got a little bit shorter. So as you walk towards your airplane, you rise above the clouds. Joining hand is an arch, and the top of the arch is cut in steel, and it's figures holding hands. And the figures come from a ceramic pot that was made by people of the Hohokam tribe. So 1,000 years old, and it has survived. And it's a celebration of community. I take it that way. People joining hands. And it was a joy to be able to do that as an image of our community too, joining hands. My family's life was so profoundly affected by conflict between different elements of the community in some sense. I mean, okay, it wasn't a close community already. It was Poland and Germany and Jews and non-Jews, but this horrible conflict, devastating conflict that destroyed so many lives, that it gives me great joy to have been able to make a celebration of the opposite of conflict, of cooperation and mutual aid. And it gives me great joy to use imagery from the population that's an ancestral population here, to use their imagery of community. When I think about my life as a survivor, for me now, there's more joy in it than suffering. I rejoice that after the enormous hardships that my parents faced, that I ended up having a happy childhood, that I've ended up having a productive adulthood with, my family and the community. And I feel so rooted in this community and feel like I contribute to celebrating what this community has to offer. And that I rejoice about that.